You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for November 10th, 2023. This week, renal denervation, a deadly decisions in the emergency department, GLP-1 agonist, and an AHA preview. I want to start by first thanking Professor Piotr Futima from Rzeszów, Poland for inviting me to the prestigious PQRST Congress there. Now this is a small meeting, but it brings in prominent speakers from all over Europe, likely because of Futima's rising status as a researcher in EP. This year, I spoke alongside two leaders in electrophysiology, Dr. Christian Sticherling from Basel, Switzerland, and Dr. Andreas Metzner from Hamburg, Germany. I also made up an entirely new talk called The Perfect Way to Avoid Procedural Complications, and I really like this PowerPoint that I made. This was my fourth time in Poland. Of the many great things about that country, what strikes me most is the strength of the fabric keeping the society together. The safety you feel there is almost palpable. I love Poland. All right, first topic is ultrasound renal denervation is now approved. The FDA recently gave ultrasound renal denervation system approval. This was based on a positive review from the advisory committee back in August. But I think this approval is highly problematic. The press release from the company that makes this device, the Paradise system, is intended as an adjunctive treatment option when lifestyle changes and medications have not adequately controlled a patient's blood pressure. To me, this is a very squishy qualification. Once FDA approved, the company can then advertise. The dinners will start, the banners at meetings, the YouTube videos, TV advertisements. Physicians who do this procedure will become key opinion leaders. The fear of missing out will then infect other medical centers. And I'm sorry to be cynical sounding, but we have seen this with a certain left atrial appendage device, which also has quite nebulous and similarly squishy qualifications. Now that it's FDA approved renal denervation, that is, payers will have to control the procedure. We will await the CMS rules and likely national coverage decision, which will, of course, easily be skirted by notes in the chart. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't appreciate the studies. I do appreciate the investigators' efforts to study and isolate the effects of this ultrasound renal denervation. The positive advisory committee meeting recommendations stem from 3 trials of renal denervation with the ultrasound system, and I'll link to my previous coverage, but they fall under the RADIANCE acronym. In February, JAMA Cardiology published a meta-analysis of the 3 trials. The difference in systolic blood pressure versus a sham control at 2 months, was 5.9 millimeters of mercury over the placebo-controlled group. Now, 6 millimeters of mercury is about what you'd expect from one blood pressure pill. It's probably less than you would expect from little old spironolactone. And I want to reemphasize, this was 2-month follow-up. At the recent TCT meeting, results of 6-month follow-up was presented for these RADIANCE trials, and it was published in Circulation. I'll link to that as well. The results here are even more modest. Now, it's important to note that medicines could be restarted between the 2 months and the 6 months. And when you read the Circulation abstract, the authors tell you that statistically more medicines in the sham arm were used than in the renal denervation arm. They then tell you that in a medicine-adjusted model, the mean difference in blood pressure is now down to 3 millimeters of mercury. The p-value is now down to 0.03, which is barely significant. So both these are statistically significant findings, but the absolute risk reductions are really small and probably not clinically significant. And again, this is only at 6 months. 6 months. For the record, here are the absolute differences. In the meds added group, it was 1.1 in the renal denervation arm versus 1.3 in the sham arm. This had a very, very small, kind of hugely small p-value, but again, a tiny difference. In a category called greater than one medicine added, 66% had more than one medicine added in the renal denervation arm versus 77% in the sham arm. And again, this was a super low p-value, but you could say that 2/3 of the groups had more than one medicine added. Okay, some other comments. One other note. Another system of renal denervation, the one called Simplicity Spiral System, this is RF ablation, received a less than warm recommendation from the advisory board last year. FDA is yet to rule on that. Let me summarize my 5 worries. First, there are no procedural endpoints with this ablation system. You just ablate and hope for the best. Now, we already know that some patients respond to renal denervation and others do not. Non-discriminate ablation is antithetical to an electrophysiologist, right? We map, we have targets, endpoints, we look at impedance drops, we look at elimination of electrograms or then inducibility. Renal denervation has nothing like this. Another worry is that I have is there's no reliable placebo-controlled data beyond 6 months, and hypertension is a lifelong thing. It sure looks like in the ultrasound renal denervation studies that the modest effect moderates over just a few months. What happens at 1 year, 2 years? My third worry is what happens when this is released into the wild. If it is anything like appendage occlusion, unwise use is going to be likely. Even a strict NCD will help some, but the idea of doing an easy, invasive procedure is potentially enticing, right? Of course, if unwise use happens, it will not be the device's fault, it would be the clinician's fault. But nonetheless, if it's there, there's going to be an incentive to use it. Another worry I have is that this unproven therapy could have complications. Femoral artery access has been transformed recently. We have this new culture in our EP lab. It's a safety culture of femoral artery access. We use micropuncture, we use ultrasound guidance, we do a brief arteriogram to make sure the stick is sound in the common femoral before we put any sheaths. But without this attention to detail, I foresee an increase in femoral artery injuries, which can be quite bad. And of course, my final worry is the worry of distraction. The more people think about a procedure, the more bandwidth moves away from proper medical management and attention to compliance with medicines and lifestyle. For instance, use of spironolactone is already way too low, and you wonder whether that'll even get lower. I don't know. Maybe it will not. I think regulators have fallen down on the job here. They had an opportunity to force longer-term placebo-controlled studies. We need more data in the space. We need a better defined procedure. It's just too early, in my opinion. All right, next topic. This is a topic titled Deadly Decisions in the Emergency Department, ? I highlight the next study as it's a teaching case in faulty inference and appraisal. JAMA Internal Medicine has published a provocative paper out of France that studied the decision to keep a patient overnight in the emergency department versus sending that patient to the ward. So this is when you decide to admit a patient and they stay in the emergency department or go to the beds. Everyone who works in a hospital knows that keeping patients in the emergency department, often on a stretcher or trolley, as it was called in the study, is less than ideal. The emergency departments are great for emergencies and triage, but doing medical ward stuff is not their expertise. Now, the authors decided to compare outcomes in 2 groups of older patients on 2 specific days in December in 97 emergency departments during a respiratory virus surge. There was both flu, RSV, and SARS-CoV-2 at this time. This was a prospective cohort study. The 2 cohorts of about 1,600 patients, one cohort was 700 patients were kept overnight on the emergency department trolley. The other cohort, about 890 of these patients, were admitted to a ward. The primary endpoint of this non-randomized comparison was in-hospital death and secondary endpoints were adverse events like falls, infection, bleeding, stroke, lots of things that happen to older patients admitted to a hospital. They collected data using the electronic health record. Of course, these are not randomized comparisons. No one would randomize staying on a trolley in the emergency department versus going up to a proper bed. So the authors used statistical adjustments for baseline differences. Here are the top-line results. Get this. Staying that night in the emergency department was not good. Patients who spent the night in the emergency department had a higher in-hospital mortality rate. The numbers were 15.7% versus 11.1%, adjusted risk ratio 1.39, so a 39% increase in mortality. Now pause there. That is a 4.6% higher death rate in absolute terms. That's a number needed to kill of 22, which is higher than the number needed to kill in the CAS trial of antiarrhythmic drugs after myocardial infarction. Now, adverse events were also higher in the overnight stay arm. Here, the adjusted hazard ratio was 1.24, confidence intervals 1.04 to 1.49. And if you were more frail, the adjusted hazard ratio for death was even higher for staying on the trolley. Here, it was an 81% increase, hazard ratio 1.81. So the authors concluded, quote, the findings of this prospective cohort study indicate that for older patients waiting overnight in the emergency department for admission to a ward, this was associated with an increased in-hospital mortality and morbidity, particularly in patients with limited autonomy. Older adults should be prioritized for admission to a ward, and I want you to note the causal verb indicate and also the phrase older adults should be prioritized. The altmetric, 6 news agencies covered the story. Nearly 1,000 people tweeted about it. An editorial accompanying the study discussed the problems of emergency department overcrowding, then discussed the results, then wrote, given the findings of this study, how might emergency departments and hospitals move forward toward improving care? The next 4 paragraphs of the accompanying editorial propose solutions to the problems in the emergency department overcrowding situation. Now, my comments on this, please go read the paper. It's a great example of causal inference run amok. Of course, staying one night on a trolley does not cause a 4% increased risk of death. That is totally implausible. Here is the main clue, that sicker patients get held in the emergency department. The hazard ratio for adverse events was lower than the hazard ratio for death. If staying in the emergency department caused death, it would have to be through a higher rate of bad things like adverse events, not magic. My friends, when you have observational comparison studies and death rates are higher than all the things that led to death, you know it has to be confounded by sicker patients in one group. Statistical adjustments try to balance the groups, but clinicians make decisions on triage and treatment based on a lot more things than are available in spreadsheets, and adjustments can't balance many of these unknown factors. By the way, the authors acknowledge this in the last part of their paper, which is behind a paywall for many readers. Here's the thing, the medical literature are full up of these sorts of studies, and we don't need them to solve important problems. ER overcrowding and keeping patients who are sick enough to be admitted on a trolley overnight, that is terrible. And we don't need a flawed observational study that purports implausibly higher death rates to strive to fix this problem. Using flawed data potentially diminishes trust. And there were tons of examples of this in the pandemic, but let's not talk about the pandemic. If a problem is bad enough, let's just pick one. Say there's not enough diversity in the medical task force. You don't need to use a flawed observational comparison study to induce change. Some problems, you just fix the problem because it's a problem. Don't try and do flawed observational studies. All right, next topic, Tirzepatide. FDA got an approval right this week. They approved Tirzepatide for chronic weight management in adults with obesity or overweight. FDA said Tirzepatide received priority review and fast-track designations for this new indication. This drug is a twofer of sorts, right? Tirzepatide is a dual glucagon-like peptide agonist and a glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, or GIP, agonist. Lilly will call the new injections of tirzepatide Zepbound, Zepbound. This drug has been approved since 2022 for treating type 2 diabetes. This new approval was based on trials called SURMOUNT-1, which was in New England, and SURMOUNT-2, which was in Lancet. Both trials had weight reduction endpoints, and both showed substantial weight reduction. SURMOUNT-2 included patients with diabetes, while SURMOUNT-1 was non-diabetic patients. Weight loss in the two trials was a lot, about 15% more than placebo. Interestingly, there was more weight loss in non-diabetic patients. Look, this is big news, and it's coming just before the big AHA show in Philadelphia. The headliner there in AHA is the SELECT trial, which for the first time for this drug class will study GLP-1 agonist with semaglutide in patients with obesity and previous heart disease, but measure cardiovascular outcomes as a primary endpoint. The company that makes semaglutide has already pre-announced positive results, so we know that semaglutide reduces major adverse cardiac outcomes. At AHA, we'll hear the details, the absolute risk reductions, how well the drug is tolerated, etc. So my comments: with the positive secondary prevention SELECT trial to be presented and recent FDA approval of tirzepatide and the super high prevalence of obesity, I have to believe we are opening a new chapter in medical therapeutics for one of the greatest medical problems that we have in modern times, obesity. But I want to leave you with some questions. One question: how shall we pay for this? At the current prices, it's going to substantially increase healthcare cost. For instance, if we're burning money on unproven therapies like appendage occlusion and renal denervation, there will be a lot less available for drugs like GLP-1 agonists, which have pretty strong proven track records in these randomized controlled trials. Another question: how will we ensure equal access to these drugs? I think this is going to be very tricky because right now, as it is with SGLT2 inhibitors, the working poor, people with limited insurance, often cannot take this drug because of cost. Another question: what about the long term? Do we really need to keep a 50-year-old post-stent obese man on weekly injections for 30 years? What are the long-term effects of these drugs? It's kind of like statins, right? We have many unknown unknowns after 10 to 20-year horizons. Recall that cardiovascular trials, all cardiovascular trials, last 2 to 5 years, maybe some surgery trials 10 years, but most of these drug trials are 2 to 5 years. But many of these therapies get carried on for longer, decades. Okay, here's another question. I've recently spent time in Oslo, Norway, and Amsterdam, Netherlands, and you know what I see? I don't see a lot of obesity. It's rare. I mean, in Norway, everyone looked like a cyclist. Now, what is it about certain cultures that have kept obesity at bay? It can't all be just genetics. There has to be something about societal norms. And my question is, could we harness some of that to help decrease our dependence on a drug that works by making us too nauseated to eat? I am asking. Let me know. I know this is a difficult topic. All right, final thing before I close, AHA preview. I'm taping this on Friday morning. This evening, I fly to Philadelphia for AHA, which begins this weekend. I wrote a preview piece on the upcoming AHA, and it's on the heart.org Medscape Cardiology website. I can't emphasize enough how big this meeting will be. Multiple huge trials will be presented, and rare is a meeting with this degree of potential game-changing trials. Now, I've already discussed SELECT, semaglutide. We know not only does it induce weight loss, but we will now learn how much it reduces cardiovascular outcomes in a secondary prevention cohort. Then, the future of PCI turns on the results of ORBITA-2, which is the second placebo-controlled trial of PCI for the reduction of symptoms of coronary disease. The boldness of these investigators in randomizing the control arm of people with severe coronary disease to a placebo procedure, otherwise known as a sham, is hard to understate. I mean, these are patients who are being randomized to a control arm. They have severe disease. The authors published the angiograms in the Lancet appendix, showing everybody how bad these lesions are, and yet some of them got nothing. And then they'll be looked at for angina symptoms afterwards. I think the Orbita-2 trial, my prediction is that it will find that in patients with enough disease, PCI does in fact improve symptoms. But OMG, if it does not, or if it only improves symptoms a little over placebo, that's going to be shocking. Then comes the Artesia trial. This is an RCT of apixaban versus aspirin for patients with short duration subclinical AFib that's found on a cardiac device, and this issue comes up almost daily. It's perhaps the number one question I get in the office. Mandrola, what are we going to do with this 5 minutes of AFib in this 70-year-old with hypertension and diabetes? Now, we learned at ESC, the NOAA AF-NET 6 trial, which was edoxaban versus placebo for subclinical AFib, that trial was stopped early for both harm, excess bleeding, and lack of benefit. In other words, NOAA said we should not treat these patients with this sort of AFib like we did with the old-fashioned kind of clinical AFib. Of course, the issue with the NOAA trial was that there was very low stroke rates. So if you have low stroke rates, it's hard to show benefits of oral anticoagulation. Artesia trial was not stopped early. It was a bigger trial. It enrolled more patients, followed them for longer. So there's going to be more stroke events. That's going to be a better chance to show stroke reduction. But Artesia also had aspirin as a comparator instead of placebo. So that's going to affect the bleeding issues, and so we'll have to look carefully at bleeding rates. Another potential big trial is the DAPA-MI trial. Now, the treatment of post-MI patients has plateaued since the reperfusion era because it's hard to improve on opening a totally blocked blood vessel acutely. But when an MI does reduce the LV function a little bit, or the MI is enough to cause Q waves, perhaps the addition of an SGLT2 inhibitor will help. Now, the problem with the DAPA-MI trial, and you're going to have to keep your thinking hat on, is its primary endpoint of numerous outcomes. And they're going to analyze these numerous outcomes with a win ratio analysis. So the top line results is going to be whether the win ratio is statistically significant. And so that's hard to figure out exactly what that means. You could have a positive result, but possibly it might not be clinically significant. Okay, so that's it. Finally, I hope to see you in Philly. I'll be around at the meeting. I have a debate on Sunday morning. I'm going to debate Brian Olshansky on AF ablation in older patients with heart failure. My debate is only 8 minutes, but I can make my point in about 3 minutes. As expected, I'm the antagonist. I'm always the antagonist in debates. So I hope to see you on Saturday, Sunday, or Monday in Philadelphia. Come say hello, and of course, follow the great team from the heart.org, Medscape Cardiology. And so that is it for this podcast. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, please rate this podcast and or give us a 1 or 2 sentence review, because these sorts of things help others find us. We'll see you in Philadelphia, and I'll have a recap next Friday. This is John Mandrola from the heart.org, Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the heart.org, Medscape Cardiology. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.